Hey everyone, Rua here. It's time for another journey through history and mythology, and also explaining how I think Square Enix incorporated tales from our world into the one they created. If you're a history or mythology buff, some of these may be familiar to you, but chances are some may well not, so I hope there's something here for everyone. Okay, let's go. The Naegling was the sword of the legendary warrior Beowulf from the epic poem of the same name. Although a very old tale, with some historians speculating it was written in the 8th century AD, the story of Beowulf has survived to this day for a good reason, as it's frankly awesome. The story follows the Scandinavian hero Beowulf in his quest for glory through battling monsters. Beowulf's poem is told in two parts. The first part opens in Denmark, where King Hrothgar's hall is being beset by a monster called Grendel. Learning of the Danes' trouble, young Beowulf, a prince of the Geats in what is now known as southern Sweden, arrives with a small band of retainers and offers to rid Hrothgar of the monster. That very night, Grendel arrives again but is met by Beowulf, who refuses to use a weapon against the monster, keen to prove his strength. Beowulf tears off Grendel's arm, forcing the monster to flee into the swamp. Suffice to say, I think Beowulf made his point. Although the Danes rejoice, the next night another monster, Grendel's mother, comes to the hall seeking revenge, but this time Beowulf takes no chances. He draws the Naegling and gives chase, eventually killing her with a blade. After the battle, Beowulf finds Grendel's corpse in the lair. He decapitates it and takes the head back to King Hrothgar as a trophy. The Danes rejoice once more. King Hrothgar makes a farewell speech about the character of the true hero, and Beowulf, enriched with honours and princely gifts, returns home to the Geats to one day rightfully assume his throne. The second part of Beowulf's poem takes place 50 years later when an aged Beowulf, now king of the Geats, defends his realm against a dragon provoked by one of his subjects when they stole from its treasure-filled lair. The fight against the dragon is long and terrible, a stark contrast to the battles of his youth. Famously, the battle is drawn out because Beowulf breaks Naegling in half, not because the blade itself had grown dull, but rather because he swung it too hard. Still, Beowulf kills the dragon, but is mortally wounded from a bite in the neck. The Naegling is referenced many times in the story as being a fine sword. However, it does not survive Beowulf's final encounter with the dragon when he needed it the most. It snapped in two, not because of the strength of the dragon's scales, but rather because of Beowulf's own strength. On that note, the Naegling of Vana'diel actually has a parallel here. As it stands, the Naegling is among the most powerful, if not the most powerful sword in the world, not because of the sword itself, but because of how strong it becomes the stronger the wielder becomes. That's rather fitting, wouldn't you say? Jupiter Dollicenus was a Roman god whose mystery cult was widespread in the Roman Empire sometime around the mid-3rd century. Like several other figures of the mystery cults, Jupiter Dollicenus was one of the Oriental gods, that is to say, Roman reinventions of foreign figures, in order to give their cults legitimacy and to also distinguish them from the cults of the traditional gods. The path Jupiter Dollicenus took getting to Rome and then rising to prominence is quite remarkable, and a prime example of how open the Roman Empire was to new ideas before the Christianization under Emperor Constantine in the early 4th century with the Edict of Milan. Dollicenus was originally a god of fertility and thunder worshipped in southeastern Turkey. Later, he was given a Semitic character. He was then identified with the Persian god Ahura Mazda, who we have covered before on this channel with Zoroastrianism, thus becoming a god of the universe. Through Greek influence, Dollicenus was renamed Zeus Oromazdes, and during this incarnation he was closely associated with the cult of Mithra, another Persian deity. When he made his final journey to the Roman Empire, Dollicenus became the consort of the Roman goddess Juno. Ancient Greek deities becoming Roman deities was commonplace, as the pantheons of antiquity were largely adaptable, Ares becoming Mars, Athena becoming Minerva, and Hephaestus becoming Vulcan, just to name a few. The worship of Jupiter Dollicenus and that of his consort was gradually carried westward to Rome and other military centres in the Roman Empire, where it became extremely popular during the 2nd and 3rd centuries AD. In the Roman mystery religion, he was not only recognized as a god of the heavens, but also believed to control military success. He was usually represented standing on a bull and carrying his special weapons, an axe and a thunderbolt. It might be a bit of a stretch, but the journey Jupiter Dolichenes took getting from the Orient to Rome is reflected in the effect of the axe that bears his name in Vana'diel. You see, the Dolichenes builds weapon skill power with a number of steps in a skill chain, in a similar manner to Jupiter Dolichenes' presence and following becoming stronger as he went from nation to nation. What do you guys think? Is that one a bit too far-fetched? Keeping with ancient Rome for now, we come to the Crocea Mors. Crocea Mors means yellow death in Latin and was the sword of Julius Caesar. Born in 100 BC and rising to the zenith of his power at 60 BC at age 40, Gaius Julius Caesar is a strong contender for the most famous statesman to have ever lived. Julius Caesar was an astute politician and an absolutely brilliant battle commander. Caesar changed the course of history for the Greco-Roman world, and arguably the entire world, decisively and irreversibly. The Greco-Roman societies of antiquity have been extinct for so long that most of the names of its great men mean little to the average person today. But Caesar's name, like Alexander the Great, lives on throughout the world. Even people who know nothing of Caesar as an historic personality are familiar with his name as a title signifying a ruler who is uniquely supreme or paramount. The Crocea Mors first appears in the Historia Regum Britanniae, or the History of the Kings of Britain, written in the 12th century by Geoffrey of Monmouth. The Crocea Mors were supposedly forged by Vulcan himself and given to the founder of Rome, Aeneas, by the goddess Venus. The Crocea Mors was found by Julius Caesar and carried by him until he fought the Briton Nennius in combat during his first invasion of Britain in 54 BC. Caesar struck Nennius, but the sword got stuck in the Briton's shield. Suddenly disarmed, Caesar had to abandon the sword, which was then used by Nennius to great effect until his death at Caesar's hands about 15 days later, at which point Caesar reclaimed the sword. According to the Historia, the Crocea Mors was a very odd sword. It was not the sharpest sword at first glance, but nevertheless it somehow inflicted incurable and inevitably fatal wounds. Anything it struck died. Ironically enough, Caesar himself. In Geoffrey Monmouth's account, the Crocea Mors is symbolic of the problems the Romans have with the British throughout history. The Crocea Mors of Vana'diel is famous for having an extremely high end spell damage, a potential reference to its odd properties detailed in the Historia. It may not be the first initial hit that does the most damage, but what follows. In Irish mythology, Dordabla, meaning Oak of Two Blossoms, is the magical harp of the Celtic god Dagda. This one's a bit difficult to pin down, as the Dordabla is also known by two other names, Euthane, meaning harmony, or Coicether Cuhia, meaning four-angled music. The problem one encounters with cataloguing ancient cultures and beliefs is that much of it was verbal history, stories passed down through generations but seldom ever written down. We therefore have precious little to go off of, but what we do have paints a decent enough picture. The Dagda was the most important god of the Celts, and is almost certainly depicted in other Celtic nations under different names. The Dagda was to Celts what Zeus was to ancient Greeks, and what Odin was to the Norse. The Dagda would play music on the Dordabla to inspire any mood in anyone who heard it, most notably warriors before they went into battle. Music played from the harp caused men to forget their fears and fight with an intense ferocity. It was his playing on this harp which made the 4 seasons arrive in their proper order. The Dagda could also summon the Dordabla by singing to it, and melodies played from the harp could instill great emotions such as sadness, merriment, or even just put people to sleep. It is described as being richly ornamented and made of solid oak. The Dordabla of Vana'diel is one of the few instruments capable of increasing the number of song effects a bard can have active, and for the longest time it was actually the only instrument capable of doing this. That the Dordabla adds 2 extra song effects, taking the total to 4, could be a reference to one of its other names, Coicether Cuhia, four-angled music. The Priwen, otherwise known as Pridwen, was the shield of King Arthur. According to Geoffrey of Monmouth, who we've already come across in this video, King Arthur's shield bore an image of the Virgin Mary, the mother of Jesus. Consequently, Geoffrey named the shield Pridwen, meaning fair face. Other sources, such as the Annales Cambriae, state that the Prydwen bore an image of the Holy Cross instead. Regardless, it's likely that the Prydwen was a kite shield, like those carried by Dark Age warriors, rather than the slightly longer shields of later medieval warriors. According to the myth, Arthur receives the rather unassuming shield during his younger years, but still goes on to use it for the entirety of its life, despite many of his fellow knights noting that it was not the most durable shield at first glance. Arthur's affinity for the shield was solidified when, after being bested in a tournament at Camelot, he went into a forest to contemplate a rare defeat. In the forest, he was joined by his friend, the wizard Merlin, who helped Arthur paint an image of the Virgin Mary, or the Holy Cross depending on whose story you're following, onto the face of his shield. Merlin did this because he thought it would help inspire Arthur, and would also give him the favour of God in the defence of his realm. The Prydwen of Vana'diel is a great paladin shield, not considered an ultimate shield, but certainly stellar. It has a remarkable block rate with a reprisal effect active, and works well in tandem with the Excalibur, achieving a block rate of near 100% with the right equipment to support it. That the Prydwen works so well with the Excalibur is very fitting since King Arthur wielded both. The Dojikiri Yasutsuna is one of the 5 greatest swords of Japan, forged during the Heian period by the Yasutsuna swordsmiths of Hoki Province, present-day Tottori Prefecture. The Dojikiri Yasutsuna was a groundbreaking sword for several reasons. These accolades stem from the technical accomplishments of its creator, the school he founded, as well as the generations of innovation that went into its design. So well crafted was this design of katana that scholars have noticed its influence on the later works of the legendary swordsmith Masamune. Legend has it that the Dojikiri Yasutsuna earned its name by killing the most feared yokai of its time, the Shutendoji, the king of the Oni. Said to have lived near Kyoto along Japan's most travelled transnational road, the Tokaido, this yokai was known to terrorize, kidnap, and kill at will all those who crossed its path. Although very likely an exaggerated telling of the highway robbers and ronin who really did camp out along this route, the Shutendoji disrupted trade and travel between the various fiefdoms and settlements of west-central Japan. That is, until around 1392, when the Shutendoji was defeated by the samurai Minamoto Yorimitsu, who decapitated it with this very sword. This legend resulted in a renaming of the sword, making it known as the Dojikiri Yasutsuna. The kiri element from the name comes from the character meaning to cut. From this point on, the Dojikiri Yasutsuna's fate among Japan's most famous swords was sealed. It became the prized possessions of shoguns Toyotomi Hideyoshi and Tokugawa Ieyasu. Today, the Dojikiri Yasutsuna resides in the Tokyo National Museum. The blade has had quite the journey through history, but it's good to know that it's still being taken care of. The Dojikiri Yasutsuna of Vana'diel is among the best great katana available to samurai. While it does not resemble its real-world counterpart, the weapon skill attached to it, Tachi Shoha, does reference its slaying of the Shutendoji. The direct translation of Shoha is Sho, to shine, Ha, to rip, to tear, to break, rend, to just generally destroy. This makes the name of the weapon skill in full, 13th style of the Tachi, Shining Rend. In Norse mythology, the Gram is a colossal sword wielded by Sigurd in the Volsunga saga. This can get real confusing real fast, because depending on the story, the Gram may have different names. One of these names is Bolmung from the Nibelungenlied. Sigurd himself also has other names across time, such as Siegfried. There are 3 stories of this hero and this sword, all which came about roughly around the same time. The Volsunga saga, the Prose Edda, and the Nibelungenlied. For consistency's sake, I'm going with the Volsunga saga, as it's the most detailed. Gram means wrath in Old Norse, and is up there with the most famous swords in the world. Before Gram was wielded by Sigurd, it was used by his father Sigmund. During a feast, Sigmund received the sword from a strange guest. Unbeknownst to him, the guest was Odin. Odin thrust the sword into a tree called Barnstoka. He then shouted that whoever pulled the sword from the tree's trunk shall receive the sword as a gift. As soon as Odin left the feast, every other man present attempted to pull the sword, however they all failed except for Sigmund, who draws it with ease. Following some chicanery one would expect from a Norse saga, Gram was eventually broken in half by Odin and Sigmund was slain. But the two halves of Gram were found and given to Sigurd. One day, many years later, a dwarven smith called Regin came to mentor Sigurd. He told Sigurd about a dragon called Fafnir, as well as the treasure that the dragon was guarding. If this sounds similar to Beowulf, then that's not surprising. Tropes from epic tales became tropes for a reason. Regin then asked Sigurd to kill the dragon, and Sigurd agreed on one condition. Sigurd was eager to prove himself, but not overly confident given Fafnir's feared reputation, so he asked the dwarf to forge him a sword capable of slaying the dragon. Twice, Regin made swords unable to meet Sigurd's requirements, but on his third attempt, Sigurd presented Regin the two halves of Gram. Regin was able to repair the blade. Sigurd then tested the sword's strength and sharpness, and did so by famously cleaving the very anvil used to reforge it in two. Before setting off to slay Fafnir, Sigurd avenges his father, laying waste to an entire army with a Gram and a small band of followers. Then, making good on his word and following his victory, Sigurd ventured to Fafnir's lair. He drew the dragon out, and with a single, powerful and well-placed strike, Sigurd killed Fafnir. Gram then served Sigurd well until his own death. Again, if this sounds familiar, it's because Sigurd's slaying of Fafnir, using a special weapon to strike a dragon's weak spot to claim its treasure, was a direct inspiration for J.R.R. Tolkien when writing The Hobbit. It's the exact same fate that Smaug the dragon meets. In Vana'diel, Fafnir appears as a H&M. Old school players might remember their times in Dragon's Ahiri well that can drop the Balmung, a clear reference to this story. Another reference, but one that's easier to miss, is that Fafnir's lair in the Dragon's Eyrie resides within the Boyada tree. If you recall, Odin thrust the Gram into Barnstoka, the giant tree in the Hall of the Volsungs at the start of the Volsunga saga. Sure, the naming of the sword is slightly off. Fafnir should have the Gram as a spoil, but I'm putting that down to Square Enix going with another version of the story. It's a very minor point. And with that, this journey through myth and history comes to an end. Leave a comment if you want me to look into something for the next installment. I'll see you all next time.